Thank you for giving me the illusion of having natural authority. Good afternoon. My name is Clement Sedmak and I serve as Director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies at the University of Notre Dame. I want to welcome you to the 2022 Laura Shannon Prize Lecture and Award presentation. The lecture will be delivered by the 2022 Laura Shannon Prize winner, the wonderful Pamela Cheek. Yes, Pamela. Here's Pamela Cheek. Yes. Who will be introduced shortly by our esteemed colleague, Professor Steve Fallon. Welcome, Pamela, our guest of honor. Dear audience, I want to welcome the Marilyn Keough, Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs, Scott Appleby and his wonderful wife, Barb. Thank you so much for being here. I want to especially welcome Claire Kelly, member of the Nanovic Institute Advisory Board and the daughter of our dear mentor and benefactor, the late Laura Shannon, who established and endowed the Laura Shannon Book Prize together with Claire's father, Mike. Welcome, Claire. It's such a pleasure to have a member of the Shannon family with us tonight. Also a round of applause for Claire. I would also like to welcome the members of the Nanovic Institute Advisory Board, especially our chair, the wonderful Jane Hayden, and colleagues of hers who serve under her leadership. Thank you, Jane, for being here. Oh, you're getting lost. I didn't see this coming. Welcome all to an event which takes place in the Elizabeth Nanovic Seminar Room. Liz is present in spirit. Please allow me to say a word about the prize. The Laura Shannon Prize was first awarded in 2010. The Laura Shannon Prize, one of the preeminent prizes for European studies, is awarded annually for the best book, did you know that, Pamela? The best book in European studies that transcends a focus on any one country, state, or people to stimulate new ways of thinking about contemporary Europe as a whole. The prize has been created by Laura and Mike Shannon. Laura came to my predecessor, Professor Jim McAdams. Right here. Yes. Steve Barrett was, kind of dark in my view. Laura came to my predecessor, Professor Jim McAdams, at one point and said, I want to do something really serious for the Nanovic, something that people will really understand the importance of for scholarship and for students. What about having some kind of prize, like a book prize? Jim, with his sound judgment, thought that this was a fantastic idea, and we all agree, I'm sure. So the Nanovic Institute is particularly indebted to Michael and Laura Shannon for this generous gift and the vision for creating it. It has become a significant part of the Nanovic Institute's mission and a way to reward and elevate scholarship, share the scholarship with the Notre Dame community, and connect jurors and a growing community of past winners. My understanding is that more than 40 Nanovic Institute faculty fellows participated in the review process for this prize cycle. And I would also like to mention that for the first time, we've organized a Laura Shannon Kylemore residency by bringing together 3 Laura Shannon Prize winning scholars for a seminar with Notre Dame faculty and graduate students in Ireland this August. The foot price of the prize is increasing. And since Pamela will blow us away tonight, you will be invited to the next residency in Kylemore. We are so grateful to Laura Shannon for her generous vision and her intellectual passion. As many of you know, our dear mentor and former advisory board member, Laura Shannon, passed away last year. May she be in the light of God who promises life in its fullness. Here on earth, Laura's legacy continues. Thank you so much, Claire, for supporting this important prize and lecture, and thank you so much for making sure that your family continues to be part of the Nanovic Institute. The jury for the 2022 Laura Shannon Prize in Humanities awarded the Laura Shannon Prize to Pamela Cheek, Professor of French and Comparative Literature at the University of New Mexico, for her book, Heroines and Local Girls, the Transnational Emergence of Women's Writing in the Long 18th Century, that's a long book title, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. The final jury also awarded a Laura Shannon Prize Silver Medal to Susan Stewart from Princeton University for her book, The Heroines Lesson, Meaning and Material in Western Culture, published by the University of Chicago Press. Barbara Mennel from the University of Florida received an honorable mention for her book, Women at Work in 21st Century European Cinema, published by the University of Illinois Press. The 2022 prize jury was composed of an accomplished group of scholars from across the humanities. Rita Bojanowska, professor of Slavic languages and literatures and chair of the European Studies Council at Yale University's Macmillan Center. Stephen Fallon, the Reverend John Kavanagh, CSC professor of the humanities at the University of Notre Dame. Robin Jensen, the Patrick O'Brien professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame. Javan McIvani, professor of French and Francophone women's writing at King's College London. And Leonard Skoff, professor of philosophy and religion and head of the Institute for Philosophical Studies at Science and Research Center Koper in Slovenia. We are very grateful for their work. Without a jury, no prize. But obviously, without prize-worthy books, no jury. So let me please turn things over to one of the eminent jurors, Professor Stephen Fallon, who is, as I mentioned, and you remember that, the Reverend John Kavanagh, CSC professor of the humanities and professor of English. He's a great scholar with research interests in Milton, early modern English literature and intellectual history, as well as lyric poetry. I would also like to mention that he co-founded a series of Notre Dame credit-bearing seminars on literary and philosophical classics at the South Bend Center for the Homeless. Steve will introduce Pamela and her book, then Pamela give her Laura Shannon Prize lecture, which will take between 39 and 41 minutes. After that, we have some time for Q&A. We will end at 6:40 so that we can use the final 5 minutes to officially bestow the award on Pamela G. We will end at 6:45, but now we begin. Steve, it's my pleasure to have you with us. Please introduce our speaker and the books. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Clemens. It was a privilege and a pleasure to serve in the jury for the Laura Shannon Prize in Contemporary European Studies. And it was a privilege also to be able to introduce this evening the winner of the prize. As you're all here to hear from the author rather than me, I'll be brief. Pamela Cheek is professor of French and comparative literature at the University of New Mexico. Her research has focused on the ways in which early modern Western European representations of sexuality and gender have contributed to cultural globalization. Her first book, Sexual Antipodes, Enlightenment, Globalization, and the Placing of Sex, published by Stanford in 2003, finds the roots of French, British, and South Seas national and racial identity in print culture's images of sexual order and disorder. As is the case with the Shannon Prize-winning book, Sexual Antipodes has an ambitious range, as Professor Cheek examines British and French popular journalism, utopian fiction, travel accounts, scientific treatises, political pamphlets, memoirs, and police reports. The book argues that sexual order and disorder became the essential lens for the focusing and defining modern national and racial identities in France, Britain, and the South Seas. The book was, not surprisingly to those of us who have read Heroines and Local Girls, praised by reviewers as sophisticated and erudite, as suggestive, insightful, and provocative at every turn, and as beautifully weaving together not only disciplines, but also national literatures too often kept asunder. While producing an impressive body of work, Professor Cheek has all the while been an exemplary academic citizen, having served as a department chair, which is quite difficult service, and serving now as Associate Provost for Student Success. In this role, she leads efforts to reduce equity gaps and improve the student experience across the university. The book we're gathered to honor, Heroines and Local Girls, the Transnational Emergence of Women's Writing in the Long 18th Century, is a keenly incisive and deeply researched work of scholarship with great historical and disciplinary significance. It's elegantly written and wonderfully readable. That's not always the case for academic books. It's also a brave book, as the author takes up the challenge of addressing writing by French, English, German, and Dutch women. Professor Cheek gives us, as one of my fellow jurors remarked, a much-needed transnational history of the emergence of women's writing as a distinct body of literature that facilitates intrasexual and textual community building. Professor Cheek argues that women's writing in the long 18th century is distinguished by several crucial differences from writing by men that has, particularly before recent decades, largely determined the canon. While male authors participated in a nationalist agon, as writers laid competitive claims for cultural authority for their national literatures, Cheek identifies the particularly transnationalist character of networks of women writers, and early on, the transhistorical nature of their themes, taking their departure from Christine de Pizan's early 15th century book, The City of Ladies. The catalogic organization of Christine de Pizan's book was influential for centuries, And in Cheek's presentation, one can see the steps by which the convention of the catalogic grouping of illustrious women from different historical periods evolved into works focused on, or ventriloquizing, groups of women learning from and teaching each other by conversation. The legacy from the Querelle des Femmes of transnational communities of women celebrated, of women reading, of women translating, and of women composing. Cheek contrasts with the model of linear transmission from male to male at the heart of the battle of the ancients and moderns. In chapter after chapter, Cheek shows her skill as a close reader of important works by women and a reliable and informative guide to the vibrant and productive European networks of women writers. Heroines and Local Girls is a groundbreaking work of serious scholarship that accounts compellingly for the origins of European women's writing as an important subject area. Cheek shows us in the book that rather than depending on male patronage to enter literary marketplaces, women cross national boundaries and class distinctions to create and supply a marketplace of their own. In an age of hyper-specialization, a trend that the Nanovic Institute's Laura Shannon Prize in Contemporary European Studies fortunately resists, Cheek has written a book that will help future scholars look at this broad sweep of women's writing, not only in the 18th century, but also in the periods before and since, with new eyes. It is my great pleasure to introduce the author of Heroines and Local Girls, Professor Pamela Cheek.
Well, it's a true privilege to be here this evening, and I'm grateful for the kind words about Heroines and Local Girls, Dr. Fallon, and for the work of the selection committee in combing through many fine pieces of scholarship. And then also to all of the people, including Clemens Sedmak, Grant Osborne, Grania McAvoy, Monica Caro, who have made my visit so delightful, along with the friends and fellows of the Institute that I've had the pleasure of joining in meals and conversation. Some of you may remember the moment in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own when she explains that one of the things that makes it harder for women to write is the unconvivial diet of stewed prunes in strapped-for-cash women's colleges. I cannot complain of any stewed prunes during my time here. And the Nanovic Institute appears to have a gift for fostering conviviality. Lastly, I'd like to thank the family of Laura Shannon, and especially Claire Kelly, for their generosity in recognizing and honoring scholarship on modern Europe, including work like mine in the humanities. It matters right now that we recommit to humanistic endeavor, and a prize such as this one helps us do that. It matters, too, that we continue to think about the legacy of Europe, how codes and ideas that were experimental, odd, or controversial 2 or 3 centuries ago structure our thoughts and lives, sometimes in ways that are barely perceptible because they now seem so very ordinary to us. One of the advantages of studying literature in the 18th century, lo those many years ago, is that it was then still rather messy. The genres that we acknowledge now, the ways of telling stories or the narrative devices of the literature of the past, all of these things that we're familiar with now, even the operation of print culture, were all still very much in formation. And so the rough edges, the patches and gaps, are visible in 18th century literature where they really aren't today. This is very much the case for the entity that we call women's writing. In deciding to talk with you this evening about the literary Me Too of the 18th century, I'm seeking to provide an account of an influential textual procedure and code at an early stage of its evolution, a stage at which, as we look back, the promise and also the rough patches are visible. And I should note here quickly, for your sake, that it will take me a bit to wind to the consideration of Me Too, and also that I won't be really relying on any very detailed descriptions of sexual violence or any images of sexual violence in the talk. One of the experiences that set me to writing Heroines and Local Girls was the regular appearance of students from around the world in my office hours. Students from Cameroon, Taiwan, Romania, the Czech Republic, Pondicherry, the Netherlands, Madagascar, Guadeloupe, France, and Iran, as well as US students from rural New Mexico or from South Carolina, maybe even some from South Bend, and I didn't know. These students would reveal that they wanted to study women's writing. And I began to wonder what they meant when they said women's writing and what women's writing meant to them. How was it that people with such different life experiences and from such different places, regions and nations with their own traditions of writing, thought of women's writing as a single thing? What led them to think that there was a unified object of study there? How could I help them in their quest to study women's writing at a point in history when the grand recovery work of lost or passed over or censored women's writing, or writing by women, all had been looked over, pored over by generations of scholars who had written tens of thousands of books and articles and even republished these works by women in beautifully prepared and edited volumes. Indeed, significant contributions to that body of work were made here at Notre Dame by scholars such as Margaret Doody and Julia Douthwaite, to whom I owe a great debt. Moreover, what was it about confessing that they wanted to study women's writing that made these students express themselves in a way simultaneously fierce, as if to study women's writing was inevitably an act of resistance, and apologetic, as if to study women's writing was not to engage in real literary scholarship, and also as if the choice might somehow marginalize themselves professionally? If I were to be a good teacher, I needed to honor their sense that there were certain, perhaps set ways that writing by women announced itself to them and produced a sense of attachment and affinity. So my questions about what was this thing, women's writing, became more urgent when I noticed that major studies on the emergence of the literary field didn't account for writing by women or women's writing. In fact, they barely mentioned women at all, with the exception of Jane Austen and Virginia Woolf. And the neglect didn't really seem like misogyny. It was more a case of a model that somehow could not fit, could not accommodate writing by women. To think about the literary field, a useful concept that was first developed by Pierre Bourdieu, is to examine what happened when literature became written, published, bought, and sold in the marketplace. And this is actually what happened over the period covered by Heroines and Local Girls. Over the course of the long 18th century, the relationship to literature in Europe and the Americas shifted decisively into becoming a market phenomenon as print became cheaper, as print capitalism accelerated, and as new groups of readers, especially women, gained access to print. As Alain Viala clarifies, the existence of a literary marketplace is a precondition for the development of claims about autonomous and elevated literary value, or claims about literary greatness. In other words, in a world of patronage and manuscript culture, texts have cultural value relative to their role in magnifying the prestige of a patron through their excellence, and relative to their fidelity and response to generally classical or scriptural models. In a literary print marketplace, in contrast, books began to exchange and valued on the basis of their economic or market capital. And here you might want to think about bestsellers, sort of New York Times bestseller list, right? Mass market paperbacks, Amazon's recommendation of books that you might like, books for you, right? And you might want to contrast that with literary aesthetic capital. So think about vaunted authors, right? Think about the Shakespeares. Think about claims about literary innovation, say James Joyce. Think about the Nobel Prize or the Booker Prize. And of course, sometimes there are works with aesthetic capital, literary capital, that have the potential to cross over. So how many of you thought, maybe as I did, maybe I should buy the works of Annie Ernaux. She just won the Nobel Prize, right? So sometimes works go from being market capital to having aesthetic capital, and that's the case of some of the works that I'll talk about today. And sometimes they go the other way, so they benefit from both, right? Scholars of the literary field connect the formation of literary aesthetic capital to the rise of nationalism and cultural contestation over national greatness, played out through the accumulation of a largely masculine literary heritage. In On German Literature, Frederick II of Prussia wrote apologetically. He sort of lamented the state of German literature. And he wrote also with the ambition of an up-and-comer. You know, his nation was actually going to be able to have literary capital someday. Someday it would have the greatness of Italy, France, and England. I'm not knocking Germany here. This is Frederick II of Prussia. He wrote, "I'm dismayed not to be able to lay out for you a more ample catalog of our good productions. I do not accuse the nation. It lacks neither spirit nor genius, but it has been delayed by causes that have prevented it from growing up at the same time as its neighbors. We are ashamed that in certain genres we cannot equal our neighbors. We desire through tireless efforts to make up for the time that our calamities have caused us to lose. Let us therefore not imitate the poor who wish to pass for the rich. Let us acknowledge our destitution in good faith, that this may encourage us instead to obtain by our own efforts the treasures of literature, whose possession will raise national glory to its full height." And, you know, he did it, right? German literature is vaunted and powerful today. As nations vied to demonstrate their national glory through obtaining the treasures of literature, one or two extraordinary women per nation might stand out, not as inheritors of a national tradition, but as glorious exceptions to the rule that women were not part of the tradition. Their very existence symbolized the high degree of cultivation, of literary attainment of their nation. What I noticed as I tried to figure out what was this thing, women's writing, that my students wanted to study, and that seems perfectly self-evident to us now as something that we can find in a bookstore, online, or in a course catalog, what I noticed was that there were particular descriptions and practices, codes, that showed up over and over again as writing by women moved into the print marketplace. Some of these codes, particularly the idea of a community of women, a garden of women, a palace of women, a city of women, where intelligent and virtuous women from across time and across nations could share their experiences in conversation, some of these codes were really quite old. So as you nicely referenced, the code of the City of Women showed up as early as the work of Christine de Pizan in the Book of the City of Ladies. And over time, repetition and iteration of these kinds of older codes began to make the idea of the City of Women or women in conversation increasingly recognizable. This particular code of the community of intelligent women in conversation contrasted sharply with the early modern and modern idea of national male authorship and national literary heritage, in which male authors were perceived as handing down a national and textual written literary tradition through a one-to-one process of mentorship and reaction from generation to generation. I'm currently really enamored of Jane Barker's iteration of the conversational community of women, which contrasts to this one-to-one generational national literary heritage that figures in representations of male writers. I'm currently enamored of Jane Barker's iteration of the conversational community of women in a work published in 1723, A Patchwork Screen for the Ladies. It's a wonderful metaphor, it's wonderfully patchy in its description and use of the codes associated with women's sociability and writing by women. And I actually pulled up so you could see what a patchwork screen is. This image here, I think the maker of this patchwork screen is actually quite proud of her work, but sort of embarrassed about showing how proud she is. It's a kind of a wonderful portrait of Lady Allgood. So this gives you a sense of the kind of detailed needlework that women would do in the 18th century. So here is Jane Barker's character, Galicia, who's met up with her ladyship, and who's going to be engaged in creating a patchwork screen. Her ladyship told Galicia she would take it kindly if her affairs would permit her to stay with her some time and assist her in her screen. Her ladyship told Galicia she would take it kindly if her affairs would permit her to stay with her some time, which invitation Galicia most gladly accepted. begging the lady to send to the next stage of the coach and carrier for her trunks and boxes, which contained her wearing clothes. The lady forthwith sent for the things, hoping that therein they might find some bits of one thing or other that might be useful to place in the screen. But when the trunks and boxes came and were opened, alas, there was no silk, there was no cloth, there was nothing that could be used in the screen. They found nothing but pieces of romances, poems, love letters, and the like. At which the good lady smiled, saying she would not have her fancy balked, and therefore resolved to have these ranged and mixed in due order, and therefore compose a screen. And thus it came to pass that the following screen was composed. In a patchwork screen for the ladies, which is actually just one volume in a trilogy about Galicia and her adventures in love and writing, Jane Barker blends together the useful task of needlework, which demanded talent and shared female labor, companionship and confidence amongst women, and then the telling of a personal history, which Galicia proceeds to do as the fragments of her writing are stitched into the frame. And this telling of a personal history is a telling of how Galicia becomes a writer. The three codes at play in this passage from A Patchwork Screen for the Ladies are going to be reiterated and iterated and reiterated over and over again. And in fact, they're already old at the time that Jane Barker uses them. The community of women who share confidences among each other, the personal history as a story of coming to writing, and the subordination of writing by women to more useful and appropriate industry, needlework. Show of hands, how many of you do needlework today? Yay, good. It continues. All of these three codes help to unify or make recognizable women's writing. They're both part of the habitus of early modern women. In other words, women still then and still today do needlework, right? It's part of the habitus of early modern women. And also part of the habitus was the conversation around the stitching together of a screen. And this Joshua Reynolds is kind of a wonderful invocation of three sisters actually making a screen together. Very, very striking image for the power of the women. These codes are something that entered into literature as patterned elements, requisite patches stitched into the screen without which women's writing could not be recognizable as such. Other codes that made women's writing into a recognizable thing were really quite new. Indeed, they weren't really possible prior to the marvelous and complicated invention of the modern novel. Sexual violence and rape have always played a role in writing. Indeed, their figuration in the European inheritance of the classical tradition is particularly significant in narratives that negotiate conflict between tribal families, political factions, and nations. As Tony Bowers has argued in Force or Fraud, early 18th century British writing by women thematized rape and sexual violence in an exploration of narrow paths of a resistance to Whiggish political authority. Their work was often quite explicit in its depiction of forced sex, which they spent time depicting partly as a way of demonstrating opportunities for political resistance, but also the restrictions and inability to resist Whiggish political authority. By the middle of the 18th century, the novel began to occupy a commanding position in the literary marketplace, aided not least by the advent of new groups of literate and avid consumers, women, urban working people, young people. Skipping over and vastly simplifying quite a bit of literary history. I'm kind of hoping there's no 18th centuryists in the audience here. So big skip here, forgive me. It's fair to say that the novel was savaged as a form of dangerous cultural pollution, as something that could draw unsuspecting and innocent readers into dangerous amorous fantasy. In 1712, The Spectator, a very popular and much-read magazine, and actually, thoughtful philosophic magazine, The Spectator warned, quote, its fair readers to be in particular manner careful how they meddle with romances, chocolate, novels, and like inflamers. I am a fan of all of those. Texts associated purely with economic or market capital, prime among them the novel, had the cultural unsavoriness of prostitution, as in Alexander Pope's description in the Dunciad of a manuscript versus a work in print. Pope describes the private manuscript as follows: it's unstained, untouched, and yet in maiden sheets, while all your smutty sisters walk the streets. The literary marketplace segmented, with bad books, in Britain sometimes also called French books, on one side, and writers and publishers sketchily declaring elevating purpose or aesthetic quality for other kinds of texts. And this was a feature of the formation of aesthetic capital, right? Literary texts that were privileged by some other kind of value, needed to differentiate themselves from crass marketplace romances. So as the segmentation occurred, women who were writers were caught. It had long been difficult to navigate the barriers to education, entry into writing, and access to publishing, not to mention stewed prunes. Our friend Galicia noted in her patchwork screen that when she finally secured a garret in which she could find a room of her own to write, it turned out that this room was a prostitute's closet. But by the middle of the 18th century, although it had long been difficult to publish as a woman, the bread and butter of romance was being taken away. Romance novels were marked as too indecent for the increasingly vast readership comprised in part, and actually increasingly large part, of proper young ladies, too indecent for proper young ladies to consume. In 1748, printer and writer Samuel Richardson published a watershed novel that proved highly successful in the marketplace and actively and successfully vied for elevation, for aesthetic capital. The full title was as follows: Clarissa, or the History of a Young Lady, comprehending the most important concerns of private life, and particularly showing the distresses that may attend the misconduct both of parents and children in relation to marriage. Anybody read Clarissa in its entirety? Ah, brave souls, very nice. It's about this thick, right? It's quite an undertaking. It's an amazing novel and a remarkable experience to read it, I must say. The bombshell in this novel was the rape of Clarissa. Richardson managed the depiction of the rape for his polite audience that included women readers at a point when, again, the literary marketplace was segmenting, and it was very important to show the distinction between polite and crass. And Richardson was a publisher, so he was also intent on the market fate of his novel. Richardson managed the depiction of the rape for his polite audience that included women readers by depicting Clarissa's imprisonment, unbeknownst to her, in a brothel, imprisonment at the behest of Lovelace, the seducer. The brothel is run by a terrifying brothel madam, Mrs. Sinclair, whom Lovelace describes in the action of restraining Clarissa from leaving. This is Lovelace in Clarissa. The old dragon straddled up to her with her arms kemboed again, her eyebrows erect, like the bristles upon a hog's back. With two "Ho, madams," she accosted the frighted fair one, Clarissa, who, terrified, caught hold of my sleeve. And thus, between terror and the late hour and what followed, Clarissa was diverted from the thoughts of getting out of the house. All of this is immediately succeeded by Lovelace's famous description of the rape to his friend Belford. And it's a line in a letter, and it's just one letter if you've never read it. And now, Belford, I can go no farther. The affair is over. Clarissa lives. And if you're an 18th centuryist, you know those lines by heart. And then the reader encounters Clarissa's post-rape papers. And you see an example of these here. I hope it's a little bit possible. Even if you can't read the words, it doesn't much matter. You see that the scattered typography on the page. It's actually quite novel and impressive for 18th century printing to be able to pull off that scattered typography. And again, Richardson as printer, was able to think about this kind of innovation in form in representing to the reader Clarissa's state of mind. So these come right after the phrase, Clarissa lives, well, a little bit later, but pretty much in the same portion of the text. The reader encounters Clarissa's post-rape papers in which the stray and disconnected bits of her thought confirm that she has lost her reason. She's incapable of writing anything like the beautiful, lucid, highly stylized, thoughtful letters that she's written earlier in the novel and that we've had access to reading. The letters then, in their disorder and lack of composition, the fragments of her thought that are actually collected and then sent to Lovelace, demonstrate that she's gone mad, that she's lost her reason. As Frances Ferguson points out in a classic article, Rape and the Rise of the Novel, Richardson accomplishes two things with this rape scene embedded in his very long novel. One, he doesn't depict the rape, so we're not shocked. Actually, three things. One, he doesn't depict the rape. Two, he announces that he's inaugurating a new national form, the now polite British novel. Readers don't have to be shocked by direct depiction of rape and seduction. And then three, he preserves Clarissa from suspicions that she's knowingly participated in a sex act. She's preserved from the appearance of having seduced Lovelace. She's preserved, as suspicious readers might have insinuated, she's preserved from the suspicion that she experienced pleasure. Richardson does all of this. He protects Clarissa from naughty implications by stipulating, as Ferguson explains, to her lack of responsibility. He demonstrates that she literally is out of consciousness. She has gone mad, and therefore she cannot be responsible for anything that has occurred in the rape. Clarissa's series of deranged and disarranged notes written during her extended post-rape illness testify to her incapacity. Scholars refer to these notes as Clarissa's mad papers. They're all but legal documents in the novel telling us that Clarissa was literally not mentally there. Now, consider the dilemma of women who were writing in this period in Europe and whose habitus, the practices and lived experiences of their group, included unwanted sexual attention or sexual violence, but not the vocabulary for talking about consent or lack of consent, and not the vocabulary for describing what we might call a dominant narrative, or more technically, hegemony. Romances were off the table as too racy, too explicit, too inflaming, like chocolate. Polite sentimental novels fostering sympathetic engagement with the emotions and interiority of the character offered tremendous possibilities, and yet, if a Clarissa or a Galicia were to describe her rape, or identify herself as raped, or explain how she felt, she risked demonstrating self-aware whorishness, her knowing and therefore willing participation in the rape. The female author, in turn, risked sanction and exclusion from the marketplace for writing something akin to pornography. But experiments with narrative, leading to the emergence of a new and influential code beyond the city of ladies, beyond the women engaged in conversation around their needlework, new experiments in narrative would offer a solution to the problem of how to indicate sexual violence without representing it, without making heroines into complicit prostitutes, and without making writers into panderers in the marketplace. One popular post-Richardsonian strategy was to expose a protagonist to the verbal manipulation of a seducer and then skip straight to her long illness, a kind of ... narrative approach that allowed readers to fill in the blanks as they chose, but never indicted the heroine for a loss of virginity. But there was a more complex strategy that was sometimes paired with the ... and it shows up in early form in a novel published in 1752, Charlotte Lennox's The Female Quixote, or Quixote. I always say Quixote, but the English people, they say The Female Quixote. Lennox used the formidable tools of narration to emphasize differences in the perception and interpretation of experience between those wielding power, fathers, aristocrats, suitors, on the one hand, and the powerless, generally unmarried women, on the other. Lennox points out that the psychological internal states of the powerless are stipulated externally by those who control language, and that the believability or lack of believability of a story of sexual violence is stipulated by those who have power. So it's actually a very clever response to Richardson's invention of a scene in which Clarissa's lack of consciousness is something that is presented to us by Lovelace and those who have power and the narrative. Here, there's a demonstration that the way power works is to control the way a story is heard and understood. In other words, Lennox and other women writers of the period discovered narrative means to communicate gaslighting, accounts of women who would tell their stories of abuse only for these stories to be dismissed as impossible with a hegemonic narrative about their silliness, their madness, their lack of competence. In the case of Lennox's protagonist, Arabella's story of living under constant threat of being ravished can all too easily be explained as a delusion that is due to her inflammation at the reading of too many romances. And she's not accused of eating chocolate, however, just she read too much, too many of those naughty romances. So it would be too laborious to walk you through how Lennox's novel does this in the narration, and how other writers did this in the form of narration itself. So I thought I would cheat a little bit and show you how engravers in the 18th century, the artists, actually interpreted these moments in narrative that expose hegemony, that expose gaslighting. And I'm going to need your help actually in reading these images, and we might have to darken the room just a little bit for you to see them. So these are lifted from books, from engravings, and the images are not quite as sharp as I would like them to be. So here's actually the title page of The Female Quixote. If you're not spending a lot of time reading 18th century texts these days, it's kind of fun to see what the frontispiece looks like. And this is the 1752 edition. And this is Charlotte Lennox herself, who was actually in Richardson's larger circle. She knew Richardson and was praised by him. So I want you to just look at the engravings. I'm not going to have the descriptions here at all, but I'm just going to walk through a number of engravings, and your job is to think about what you see, the kind of attitude or experience or response that you have from the visual images. You see the man in the background there. That one's a little bit hard to perceive, and that's Arabella, Lennox's heroine, in the front. Okay, so anyone want to help me out? What kind of attitude or positioning of Arabella, what kind of general atmosphere is communicated by these images produced by this engraver?
Fear.
Fear? Mm-hmm. And is the fear legitimate or illegitimate?
She's always watched.
And what is it a fear of? Excuse me?
I mean, of men.
Of men, yeah. There's a fear of men, absolutely. Every single one of them, right? There's a man in the distance, a man near her. I think this one is particularly articulate, right? It's quite remarkable the way her arm is being twisted. Now, the joke of The Female Quixote, of this novel, is that Arabella has read too many romances, and so she's afraid at every step that somebody is going to rape her, but no one ever does. And she's told by the men around her, no, you've read too many romances. You're deluded. Nobody's going to rape you. You're fine. This is ridiculous. But in fact, what's going on with with Arabella, is that she's being manipulated by the man who controls her fortune, and that there are fortune hunters who are trying to seduce her so that she will actually be positioned so that she has to marry them. So in fact, she's surrounded by vile seducers who want to manipulate the atmosphere around her and who have a strong interest in arguing that she's deluded because she's read too many romances. So I'll give you the joke treatment of Arabella's experience. So there's a couple in the wood. Arabella starts to run away from Mr. Glanville, who's actually nominally the hero, because she's afraid of being carried away by an unknown assailant who is actually just a farmer. Then here, her indignation she thinks her uncle is actually trying to woo her. Well, actually, her uncle is trying to control her fortune. And here, Arabella is afraid of the presence of a man in the gardener. It turns out that it's Edward the gardener. Ha ha. And here, she's running away because a man has arranged a tryst in a garden, and he intends to use it to entrap her so that she will have to marry him in order to protect her virtue. And here we have a conversation between women in which women are soothing themselves by telling each other their stories. And finally, I can't show you the slide because it doesn't exist. There is, in fact, a scene in The Female Quixote in which Arabella is pursued by two unknown men. And there's never an explanation given in the narrative as to why they're pursuing her or what might have happened. She jumps into the Thames, and she's rescued, and then she has a very, very long illness. Now, the reason for showing you this is that I think that the engraver is actually remarkably perceptive. He's able, in kind of an amazing way, to depict for us the ha-ha. She thinks she's going to be raped. She thinks she's going to be forced. She's read too many romances. She thinks she's being manipulated into marriage. But at the same time, the seriousness of the current of a world in which her story cannot and will not be heard is communicated visually by this series of engravings. And perhaps the false step of the engraver from a contemporary perspective is that he never depicts the moment in which Arabella probably is in fact at risk of an actual rape. Both 18th century novels by women and Me Too accounts today depict the struggle to resist gaslighting and to assert control over an account of experience that has been hegemonically interpreted or overwritten by men. The ha-ha, you've read too many read too many romances. Even today, as I wrote in Heroines and Local Girls, it's difficult to identify many fictional depictions of women's interiority, their sentiments, their thoughts, and their consciousness that are not narratively triggered by and that do not unfurl within the context of psychosexual as well as epistemological and cultural siege. Combined with the codes of the community of women and the coming to writing, this very modern novelistic code that I tried to kind of reproduce for you in visual form, the struggle to resist gaslighting and to assert control over an account of experience that is regularly interpreted for you by others, this code was critical to the invention of women's writing. And it formed the basis for a new kind of capital that women who were writing could modestly claim as their own, not the literary greatness of national aesthetic capital, not the risky pollution or commonness of market capital, but rather identity capital, the capital of representing an experience common to women, shared by women, for women, in a story and language that preserved their virtue and belonged only to them, and that, importantly, also represented the pattern of repression of their story. This was the literary Me Too of the 18th century, and it was, to say the least, tremendously powerful in the literary and political legacy that it left for women writers and women readers. Now, the struggle to control the account of one's perceptions and the story of one's experiences is just one of the codes to emerge in the 18th century that supported identity capital. It's one textual and cultural procedure that revolved around depictions of domination and subordination, exclusion and inclusion. When women's writing invented this code and collected it together with the other codes that became recognizable features of women's writing, it opened a space in the literary field for other kinds of writing that traded on not national aesthetic capital or market capital, but identity capital. Such works depend in different ways on the code of representing the differential experience of their readers gathered in an affinity community and the suppression of their story by hegemonic narratives and forces. What I want to close with is the caution that for all its tremendous importance in communicating the violent forcing of experience through the control and overwriting of the stories of women, the formation of women's writing as a transnational market category, as something that traded on identity capital in the 18th century, paved the way for the global literary marketplace's segmentation of affinity-based reading publics. Identity capital is critical for forming affinity, connection, around the struggle shared by members of an affinity group to control the account of their own experience. In other words, when you build the recognizability of a kind of literature, a set of novels, a kind of genre around connection between individuals and the repression of their story and their interest in telling their story once and for all in their own words, there are tremendous advantages in producing group formation, and there are tremendous disadvantages in terms of engendering tribalism. After the long 18th century, identity capital went on to organize narrative accounts of experience based in sympathetic engagement with subordination around class, around race, around ethnicity, around sexuality, around religion, age, geography, disability, migration, the post-colonial condition, hillbillies. Indeed, the marketplace thrives on identity capital, as Ray Chow points out when she discusses the process of a subordinated group's rise to visibility. Chow notes how this process engages a repressive hypothesis. The conceptualization of what is repressive is reinforced simultaneously by the incessant generation and proliferation of discourses about what is supposedly being repressed. So I'm not saying that there isn't validity to the telling of stories by women about sexual violence. And I'm not saying that there isn't validity and tremendous importance for identity, liberation, connection in the telling of stories about group membership and the suppression of the stories that people have to tell about their experiences. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that market capital, in its inevitable ways, seized upon the power of identity capital to create an ever more segmented market in which there was constantly an interest in demonstrating the inability to communicate personal experience for a group to members outside that group. The use of personal stories to make claims about the differential experiences and perceptions of identity groups outperformed initial 18th century expectations about the capacity of individual stories to engender shared sympathy. Identity capital today aligns sympathy internally around a differential account of perception and truth. It's fueled by an information economy that thrives on manipulating the account of experience around rigid identity boundaries, and it thrives on multiplying market segments and their audiences. Sympathy travels internally in these narratives rather than across micro-market sectors. The 18th century identity capital that propelled women's writing into becoming a recognizable thing that my students want to study, this identity capital exceeds all proportion in the present. It's a super performer. The sympathetic potential for recognizing shared humanity that was at the core of the use of identity capital in women's writing, this potential for sympathy that was supported by repetition and variation of the textual codes and features surrounding identity capital, has perhaps been gutted by the marketplace. So all of that possibility that women's writing, when it became a thing, represented, has been eviscerated by the micro-segmentation of affinity groups and the strategies that have been developed to use the telling of stories and to represent the repression of the telling of stories for the purposes of serving market capital. Nonetheless, despite the failed promise of this remarkable invention in the 18th century, the power to narrate gaslighting, the power to demonstrate the difference between what authority and how authority tells the story and how an individual might tell the story. Despite the promise of this incredible invention and also the failure of this incredible invention, I continue to be moved and amazed by the students from around the world who come to me grasping works that mobilize them, who find something transformative and liberatory and empowering in the claim to a story written in a voice that they themselves share. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pamela. We have 12 minutes for Q&A. And the floor is open. Tony, please. You get a mic from Anna.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful paper. And I was really, really grateful for hearing something about the 18th century, which I ought to. I'm a classicist, so I don't read a lot of 18th century literature, but I should. I have 2 points really here, both of which are sort of questions, points, whatever. One is, aren't you being a little bit too negative? Isn't at the very, with your diagnosis of the current splitting up, segmentation, it just occurs to me that while I'm a woman, I read books by and about men, by and about disabled people, by and about addicts, people living in other cultures. So is the segmentation not also a possibility to understand not only the otherness, but then again to identify?
I think you gave the last paragraph of my talk. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, sorry.
And no. I mean that I didn't give, right? Thank you for filling it out. Absolutely. I mean, that's the marvelous potential of an invention such as this code of being able to represent the repression of stories, right? The hegemonic domination of an individual's ability to communicate their individual story. So the novel at its best actually shows us how that's at work, and it gives us the opportunity to delve into the experience and the story of another. But the novel at its worst, right, tells us that we're not allowed to have entry into that kind of experience, that we can't truly understand or access the experience of someone who is different than we are. And there's an interest in the marketplace in accelerating those divisions so that groups become increasingly walled off by this claim that their story isn't and can't be heard, and that individuals can't walk across that barrier. So I couldn't agree with you more. And again, it's the ambivalence, right? You know, when it emerges in women's writing, it's this kind of amazing, fantastic thing. And then there's the flip side, right? Yeah.
Thank you. I do have another question, but I want to hand it over and get
Just ask your second question.
Okay. I guess my very quick question. I mean, I have a problem with reading Jane Austen, and I saw the problem sort of, embedded mostly in this book, The Female, however you pronounce that, Quicksilver. I mean, why do you think, or was it a necessary condition for women while doing all of those things, while creating a space for talking about their experiences and their being gaslighted, whatever, was it necessary at the same time to not take themselves seriously, to be a little bit ha-ha about themselves?
Well, I mean, that's actually the kind of the wonderful thing about Charlotte Lennox is that she is very ha-ha, you know, and it would take a lot more to actually really do justice to the novel than what I was able to do here. And of course, Jane Austen is very clever in what she does. You know, one of the things about Jane Austen that's kind of extraordinary is that she's kind of the genius aggregator as, you know, a figure like a Milton or a Shakespeare, as they are, right? They bring together the stories and the forms that have already been used so many times, and they bring them all together, and then they just do this kind of tremendous, amazing thing that's a little bit different with them. And Jane Austen actually relies on this, you know, century of seduction narratives. And then she flips them on their head, but she flips them on her head actually in ways that are not all that different from the way that Lennox all but flips them on their head, by on the one hand, you know, laughing at the idea that somebody is about to be seduced, and on the other hand, demonstrating that the women in her novels are always subject to coerced choice, right? They're fundamentally never positioned in a way that's going to allow them to exert free choice about what happens to them. And it's that struggle, right, to exert free choice that really forms the narrative tension in those novels.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for a really wonderful talk. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about placing your work in the broader perspective of women's history, women's studies in the 18th century. And I'm thinking of work like by Tina Goodman, for example, and the salon culture, where she makes a very persuasive argument that women may not have written that much, but they play this crucial role as intermediaries. And it seems to me that I'm wondering about whether there's any intersection between your writers and salon culture. Is there anything going on there that could link these, what seems on the basis of your talk today, two very different ways of looking at women intellectuals in the 18th century?
Yeah, and it's so lovely that you know Tina Goodman's work. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Okay, next question.
Yeah, so it's a wonderful question. So a whole other portion of Heroines and Local Girls actually spends quite an enormous amount of time actually trying to look at networks among women, and also tries to trace the kind of transition beyond the women as cultural mediator figure into the positioning of women as authors in the marketplace. Interestingly, salon culture, for the most part, and I don't want to make a kind of a categorical statement here, but for the most part, salon culture, particularly as Goodman describes it, created relationships between one or two women and then the cultural luminaries that they were serving as mediators for when they convened a salon. Very rarely do you actually have multiple relationships between women coming out of salon culture. Where relationships among women writers were fostered was actually primarily via print. So the kind of affinity that I was talking about being developed when a woman reader encounters the kind of narrative of gaslighting, and also the strategies for making her into a sympathetic member of this companionate community of women readers that are part of the 18th century novel. When women readers encountered those kinds of strategies in the evolving novel, they experienced a strong sense of affinity with the women writers whom they were reading, and they would write letters to other women, and they would rewrite the novel of the woman that they just read, and they would translate the novel of the woman that they just read, or they would create an alternative ending to the novel that they had just read by another woman. So the circles of women are actually virtual circles, right? They're not actual physical salons, although we do have documented cases of women coming together in tea parties, for instance, but they're actually textual affinities. It's kind of remarkable to look at the prefaces and the frontispieces of various texts, because what you see is a set of relationships, often with women writers kind of trying to use a relationship, right, in order to kind of jockey themselves into place in the marketplace, right? Oh, my good friend Hester Chapone. Well, the author of that line, in fact, had never met Hester Chapone, but my good friend Hester Chapone, whose wonderful work, or so-and-so wrote a review of my work. That kind of networking, that's actually quite modern. It was really the way that these affiliations were created amongst actual women writers.
Probably the last question, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the talk. That was terrific, and also for your answer just at this last answer. It sort of feeds into the question. So I'm with you on the formation of solidarity through affinity groups and so on in the 18th century. And then I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the broader historical arc that you were gesturing towards at the end of the talk. So the moment when the market capital, instrumentalities of the market, whatever, capture and start to erode or diminish the affinity groups, the possibilities of solidarity, et cetera, as you alluded to. I mean, is that a story of the sort of gradual institutionalization of the literary enterprise, the book publishing industry, mass media? I mean, sort of, is there an inflection point, or is it a kind of slow crawl into hyper-segmentation and capture?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and a couple volumes later I might be able to answer. I mean, it's actually true that Hart and Negri have dealt with this in their work, right? The idea of this kind of hyper-segmentation of the market to address and also kind of create, right? It's not just that you're addressing a pre-existing identity group, you're actually creating an identity group through the use of these kinds of codes. I think that rises in a steady functional relationship with the acceleration of print capitalism. One of the things that, one of the reasons you become an 18th centuryist is that you're really interested in the creation of the mass reading market, right? Mass markets don't really exist prior to the 18th century. So all of the questions that we now have around how masses are moved by media, you can start, again, in kind of patchy, broken, not fully formed ways, you can sort of start seeing them beginning to happen in the 18th century. So every time you get a new media technology, there's the opportunity to build a specific micro market with that technology, and there's an opportunity to use these tried and true, powerful liberatory codes, that were part of women's writing, but to use them in the creation of segmenting audiences, and all fueled by capitalism. So that's not 3 volumes, but it gives you a little bit of a picture.
Thank you so much. So we have 2 more minutes, and I would ask you to answer my question in 2 sentences. What's the secret of good writing? Our students ask us all the time, what's the secret of good writing? How do you do it?
Oh, goodness.
1 minute left.
Okay, first there was an assumption there that I engage in good writing, but things...
That's why I got the prize. Many reasons, but that was one of them.
Second, I honestly think that for me, it's had a lot to do with layering and sticking with it. And I hate to admit that there's a moment with all of my pieces of writing and certainly both books, but anything else I've written, where I kind of hit this moment of abjection, right? This sort of sense of it is all miserable, it is all terrible, every word that's going to come out of my pen or my computer is going to be horrifying, and I am at the bottom, and so therefore, why not, right? Like, what do I'm always awful, why not? There's nothing to lose. So it's this kind of, muck at the bottom of the pit that you slowly rise from, and then you just layer and layer and layer. And then I think it's also the inspiration of reading the work of people like Dina Goodman, that's tremendously inspiring, and that gives you ideas, and then somehow, you've got to be able to answer that question that's posed by this other scholar.
Wonderful.
So
Thank you very much. So, 6:40. We have 5 minutes for the award ceremony. We didn't get it.
We did it.
No, it's happening. So, Axel Honneth, the German philosopher, talks about 3 forms of recognition. Social recognition, this is the audience. They came because of you, not because of me, because of you. Symbolic recognition, that's what Monica has in her hand. And material recognition. So this is not a bottle of wine, but you can buy some bottles of wine with that. I put this here. And this is, Claire, will you give this to our prize-winning author here? So this is the official centerpiece of your office from now on. Yes? You have to take a picture. Yeah, you want to do this. Take a picture. Yeah. Congratulations again. Thank you so much. And at the end, we want to thank Claire and your family for the prize. We want to thank Steve for the wonderful introduction. We want to thank our advisory board members, our dean, everybody who came here, and of course Pamela for writing this beautiful book, from which we will learn in the future, for being our guest of honor tonight. And the evening is not yet over. Chosen guests will go to dinner. Thank you and have a good rest of the night.